Dawn, October 23, 1943. The mist clung to the ridges of the Finisterre Range in New Guinea like a shroud. Rain fell in thin sheets, turning the jungle earth into a black, sucking mire. Japanese troops of the 78th Infantry Regiment crouched along the slippery slopes, their uniforms soaked, their boots caked with mud. They listened for the familiar sounds of war, rifle cracks, mortar shells, the grinding of heavy artillery being hauled up the mountain. Instead, what drifted through the fog was something they could not comprehend. The distant growl of engines. Not tanks, not trucks, smaller, higher-pitched, almost insect-like. And then, through the curtain of mist, they appeared, American jeeps climbing where no vehicle was meant to climb. Australian Army War Diary, October 1943. The Japanese stared in disbelief. These lightweight machines, open-topped, canvas-covered, their headlights blacked out, scrambled up trails that oxen had failed to ascend. They churned through ruts, leapt over rocks, and pulled supply trailers laden with ammunition, medical gear, and fuel cans. For soldiers who had spent weeks breaking their backs with bamboo stretchers, hauling 75mm mountain guns piece by piece, it was as though the enemy had harnessed some unnatural advantage. One Japanese sergeant captured later admitted, "We could not understand how they moved so fast. We believed the mountain belonged to us. But the Americans drove their machines over it as if it were a road." Interrogation report. Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, Nov 1943. The Jeep's silhouette was already becoming iconic across the Pacific, but in the mountains of New Guinea, it acquired the aura of a phantom weapon. To the Japanese, it was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of American logistics, of a war machine that seemed to flow like water through terrain designed to halt armies. U.S. Army Quartermaster Review 1944. Yet the story of how this moment came to pass stretched back years, long before jungle trails and mountain ridges. In 1940, as war spread across Europe, the U.S. Army had realized it needed a light reconnaissance vehicle to replace motorcycles and horse-mounted scouts. The demand was for something fast, rugged, capable of carrying a machine gun, and cheap enough to be mass-produced. What resulted, after frantic design contests and factory bids, was the Willys MB and the Ford GPW, collectively known as the Jeep. By 1945, over 640,000 of these nimble machines would roll off American assembly lines, more than any other single military vehicle of the war. U.S. War Production Board Report 1946. When U.S. troops landed in New Guinea in 1942, they entered one of the most brutal battlegrounds of the Pacific. Dense jungles swallowed whole battalions. Rivers turned into torrents overnight. Malaria and dysentery claimed more men than enemy bullets. For the Japanese 18th Army, which had advanced across the island in 1942, these conditions were both ally and enemy. They slowed the Allies, but they also ground down Japanese supply chains. Already overstretched from Rabaul to Leh, pack animals collapsed, wagons bogged down, and every sack of rice had to be carried on a soldier's back. Australian Official War History, Volume 6. The Americans arrived with a different philosophy. Instead of surrendering to the terrain, they sought to conquer it through machines, improvisation, and sheer industrial scale. The Jeep became the spearhead of that approach. Where horses drowned and bicycles rusted, Jeeps splashed across rivers with waterproofed ignitions. Where wagons broke, Jeeps were disassembled and carried up ridges by teams of engineers, only to be reassembled at the top. On mountain trails that Japanese soldiers swore were impassable, Jeeps climbed, pulled, and hauled. U.S. Army Engineer Report 1943. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese officers wrote in field notes, later recovered by Australian patrols, that the Americans seemed to have a vehicle for every purpose and a road wherever they wished to move. Captured Japanese document Kokoda Sector, 1943. For soldiers taught to revere human endurance, the sight of machines bypassing months of grueling labor felt like a betrayal of the natural order of war. A road was no longer required. The Jeep made its own road, but behind the myth, the machine was deceptively simple. A 60 horsepower Go Devil engine, designed by Willys engineer Delmar Barney Roos, powered it. Its short wheelbase allowed it to pivot in mud, where trucks stalled. Four-wheel drive provided traction on slippery gradients that would bog down heavier transports. Soldiers joked that the Jeep could climb a tree if the driver wanted it to. Motor Transport Corps Test Log, 1942. And yet it weighed barely a ton, light enough that 8 soldiers could lift it from a ditch and back onto the trail. This fusion of strength and agility transformed the battlefield. In New Guinea, this meant American and Australian forces could move artillery into places the Japanese never anticipated. Entire 105mm howitzers, broken into pieces, were dragged by jeeps up goat tracks, then reassembled in hidden jungle clearings. Medical units strapped stretchers across the vehicles, transforming them into rough ambulances that saved thousands who would otherwise have died in the mud. Engineers used them to haul timber and wire for makeshift bridges. U.S. Army Medical Corps Report, 1943. By mid-1943, as the Allies advanced towards Salamaua and Leh, Japanese defenses began to falter. Not simply because of bombing raids or naval blockades, but because their enemies seemed to materialize in unexpected places at impossible speed. Patrols that should have taken days appeared overnight. Outposts starved not only because supplies were cut, but because Americans delivered their own with uncanny ease. To the Japanese, the Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was a force multiplier, a reminder that the United States could bend industry to break nature. The terrain of New Guinea had promised the Japanese a fortress. It had instead become their prison. Their soldiers, bound by tradition, marched on bleeding feet, while their enemies drove steel ponies that ate mud and climbed mountains. In a war where every ridge cost lives, the ability to bring a vehicle to the fight, any vehicle, was revolutionary. And the revolution had only begun. For as the war expanded into the Philippines, Burma and China, the Jeep would prove again and again that mobility was power, that machines could shift the balance in battles, once thought determined only by numbers and courage. The Japanese had seen the first hints of this in the New Guinea ranges, but they had yet to witness the true scale of what these little vehicles, and the industrial juggernaut behind them, could unleash on the battlefield. And so, as the jeeps climbed into the fog, engines humming like a chorus of inevitability, the Japanese soldiers of the 78th Infantry Regiment could only watch, stunned. They had prepared to fight men, but what came at them was something else. An enemy who carried mountains on wheels. What they could not know was that these machines were only the beginning, that the secret advantage the Allies wielded was far deeper than steel and rubber. It was an entire system, a hidden strength ready to erupt in the next battles of the Pacific. January 10, 1944. Luzon's northern approaches were shrouded in rain, the trails slick with mud, the kind of terrain that in theory should have favored the Japanese defenders. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had fortified the ridges with machine guns and bunkers, confident that the Americans would be forced to crawl forward under fire. But then came the same sound that had haunted Japanese units in New Guinea, the buzzing, determined growl of jeeps climbing paths that seemed impassable. Within hours, American patrols appeared where Yamashita's staff had sworn no vehicles could go. His officers scribbled in their diaries, "They drive their wagons into the clouds," dramatized composite. Captured Japanese officer notes, Luzon Campaign 1944. The secret, of course, was no magic trick. It was engineering and mass production, the marriage of simplicity with reliability. The Willys MB, the archetypal Jeep, was designed with brutal functionality in mind. Its engine, the Willys Go Devil L134, produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. Weighing just over 2,400 pounds loaded, the Jeep could hit 60 miles per hour on roads, but more importantly, it could crawl through jungle mud at 5 mph without stalling. Its 80-inch wheelbase and 16-inch ground clearance allowed it to negotiate ruts, gullies, and boulders where trucks bogged down. Technical Manual TM 9803, 1943. Every inch of its design had been stress-tested for combat. Its waterproofed ignition and ventilation system meant it could ford streams up to 21 inches deep. The four-wheel drive, controlled by a simple lever beside the driver's seat, gave it traction on gradients approaching 45 degrees. Its steel body could take dents, splinters, and rough handling. Soldiers joked that if the Jeep didn't work, it could be fixed with wire, tape, or a hammer. Quartermaster Technical Bulletin, 1943. Behind the engineering was a web of American industry. Willys Overland in Toledo, Ford Motor Company in Detroit, and hundreds of subcontractors churned out gearboxes, differentials, and axles. At peak, a Jeep rolled off the line every 2 minutes. War Production Board, 1944. But the Jeep was not only an American triumph of design, it was a nightmare for Japanese planners. Their supply chains depended on human porters and the occasional mule. Heavy trucks and artillery tractors were rare, and those few that existed quickly bogged down in jungle mud. When the Americans surged forward with Jeeps pulling trailers of ammunition and mortars, it shattered the balance of mobility. A Japanese infantryman's legs could carry him 20 miles in a day. A Jeep could carry him and 6 of his comrades 50 miles with gear, weapons, and medical kits in tow. Bureau of Logistics Report, Southwest Pacific Area, 1944. In Burma, British and American forces used Jeeps to smash through terrain thought impassable. The famed Merrill's Marauders, the 5307th Composite Unit, carried out deep penetration raids behind Japanese lines in 1944. Their Jeeps hauled radios, Browning M1919 machine guns, and 60mm mortars into the dense Burmese jungle. One veteran recalled, "They went where mules wouldn't go. We took them apart, winched them up slopes, then put them back together. The Japs didn't believe machines could live there." Veteran Oral History, Merrill's Marauders, U.S. Army Center of Military History. The Marauders' raid on Myitkyina in May 1944 proved the point. As monsoon rains fell, Japanese defenders expected the Allies to falter. But Jeeps, lashed together with ropes and winches, dragged howitzers through the mud. When they reached Myitkyina's airfield, the defenders were stunned to see Jeeps roaring out of the jungle, headlights covered, machine guns mounted on pintle mounts, spraying fire. One Japanese officer, captured weeks later, confessed, "We heard motors where no motors should be. We thought it was impossible." Then they were in our trenches. Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, Burma Campaign Report, July 1944. Technically, these Jeeps were marvels of adaptability. They could be fitted with 30 caliber or 50 caliber machine guns, bazooka racks, even stretchers for wounded men. Engineers welded steel plates to turn them into makeshift armored cars. Others mounted radio sets, turning Jeeps into mobile command posts that linked infantry to artillery and air support. Motorola and Signal Corps technicians designed compact FM radios that fit neatly into the rear of a Jeep, allowing commanders to coordinate strikes across mountains in real time. Signal Corps Technical Report, 1944. Factories back home fed this versatility. At Willys' Toledo plant, women on assembly lines riveted body panels, tested engines, and wired ignition systems. In Detroit, Ford plants that once produced sedans now stamped Jeep chassis. The industrial miracle meant not only that hundreds of thousands of Jeeps rolled out, but that parts were interchangeable. Willys and Ford models were virtually identical, so repairs could be made anywhere with salvaged components. U.S. War Production Statistics, 1945. The Japanese could not match it. Their Type 95 Kurogane scout car was small and light, but only 4,800 were built throughout the entire war. By contrast, America produced nearly 640,000 Jeeps. The disparity in numbers alone ensured that on every front, New Guinea, Burma, the Philippines, Allied troops were more mobile, more supplied, and more coordinated. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Nowhere was this advantage more decisive than in the Battle of Leyte, October 1944. When General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, his forces faced rugged terrain, rice paddies, and shattered roads. Japanese defenders banked on slowing the American advance to a crawl. But Jeeps, mounted with radios and machine guns, spearheaded the push inland. Units of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division drove Jeeps across rice dikes under fire, relaying coordinates to artillery that shattered Japanese strongpoints. Jeep convoys brought wounded back to beachhead aid stations, saving thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost in the mud. After-action report, 1st Cavalry Division, Leyte, 1944. One firefight at Breakneck Ridge in November 1944 showed the Jeep at its deadliest. Japanese machine gun nests pinned down American infantry. Then out of the jungle, 3 Jeeps appeared, each mounting a 50 caliber Browning. They skidded into firing positions, gunners blazing, spraying the ridge with suppressive fire. Within minutes, the Japanese were silenced, their position overrun. Survivors later wrote that The enemy had small tanks that came from nowhere and dramatized composite. Captured soldier interrogation, Leyte, 1944. The Jeep's triumph was not only physical, but psychological. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to respect endurance and sacrifice, suddenly found their hardships meaningless. Why carry shells for days when the enemy drove them forward overnight? Why bleed on a jungle trail when the Americans roared past in steel steeds? The frustration gnawed at morale, feeding despair. U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Report, 1945. Yet to the Americans, the Jeep was not glamorous. Soldiers treated it as a tool, a beast of burden. They gave it names, painted cartoons on its hood, lashed sandbags to its sides. For mechanics and engineers, it was a canvas of improvisation, patching holes with salvaged metal, rewiring circuits with field telephones, keeping the machines alive in heat and rain. One lieutenant quipped, "The Jeep was our best friend. It got us to the fight and it got us home." Veteran Diary, Luzon Campaign, 1945. By early 1945, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever Jeeps went, the Japanese position crumbled faster than expected. Battles that might have taken months fell in weeks. Positions thought secure became vulnerable. The Jeep was not the heaviest weapon, nor the most fearsome. But it was the hidden edge. Mobility made steel. Mass production made strategy. The Allies had unlocked a battlefield truth the Japanese never truly grasped. Speed, flexibility, and supply lines mattered more than static defense or sheer willpower. The little Jeep, humming up trails and through mud, carried that truth like a standard into battle. And as the war pressed closer to Japan itself, its soldiers began to wonder what other hidden advantages the Americans had yet to reveal. August 15, 1945. The guns had finally fallen silent, but the echoes of war lingered across the shattered landscapes of the Pacific. On Okinawa, Jeeps rattled along coral roads where once only hand-carried stretchers had passed. In Manila, Jeeps threaded through ruins, ferrying children and refugees as easily as they had once hauled ammunition. Across every island chain, their boxy silhouettes stood as reminders that modern war was not won by sheer courage alone, but by the relentless marriage of manpower and machinery. U.S. Army Signal Corps Photo Archive, 1945. Strategically, the Jeep had rewritten mobility doctrine in the Pacific. What had once been thought of as infantry-only terrain, jungles, mountains, swamps, had been penetrated, exploited, and controlled by units equipped with lightweight vehicles. Campaign after campaign showed the same pattern. In New Guinea, Jeeps allowed artillery to reach ridges. In Burma, they gave deep penetration raiders firepower far behind Japanese lines. In the Philippines, they carried radios that linked infantry to artillery and aircraft, compressing the tempo of battle from days to hours. Each campaign multiplied the psychological pressure on the Japanese, who found their carefully planned defenses crumbling not only under firepower, but under the speed of the American advance. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Japanese interrogations after the war revealed a haunting theme: disbelief. Officers spoke of machines appearing where no machines should exist. Infantrymen admitted feeling outpaced and outnumbered. Though enemy numbers were not greater, dramatized composite, Allied translator and interpreter section, post-war debrief, 1946. Their faith in the power of will and endurance shattered against the reality that endurance alone could not outrun rubber tires and gasoline engines. For men trained to glorify hardship, the Jeep was a reminder that hardship itself could be rendered obsolete. For Allied soldiers, the vehicle forged an entirely different bond. Veterans recalled Jeeps with affection that bordered on reverence. They gave them names: Lil Abner, Killer Dilla, Raggedy Ann. They decorated them with cartoon pin-ups, mascots, and graffiti. Mechanics spoke of them as companions, marveling at their stubborn ability to keep running despite broken axles or bullet-riddled frames. You could take a Jeep apart in the morning, fix it with scrap, and it would be running before nightfall, one veteran remembered. Veteran interview, U.S. Army Oral History Program, 1947. The Jeep was not glamorous like a fighter plane, nor terrifying like a Sherman tank. It was something more intimate, personal, dependable, indispensable. But sustaining that dependability required an invisible army: engineers, factory workers, and supply officers. At Willys plant in Toledo, Thousands of women riveted frames, tested engines, and packed crates with spare parts. In Ford's River Rouge complex, where once sedans had rolled out, jeeps thundered down assembly lines at industrial speed. Field depots in the Pacific stockpiled transmissions, tires, spark plugs, ensuring that no vehicle stayed broken for long. The genius of the Jeep was not just its design, but its compatibility. Ford parts fit Willys models, meaning that a single warehouse could keep entire divisions mobile. War Production Board Final Report 1946. Logistics had become as decisive as firepower, and the Jeep was the symbol of that truth. This advantage rippled outward into doctrine. American commanders learned that speed, enabled by mobility, could collapse enemy positions faster than attrition. By 1945, U.S. forces planned operations with an assumption of Jeep-borne logistics. Artillery would arrive on slopes, wounded would be evacuated within hours, and radio-equipped Jeeps would keep headquarters in constant contact with frontline squads. This philosophy outlived the Pacific War. During the Cold War, NATO's emphasis on mobility and mechanization through Jeeps, half-tracks, and later Humvees owed much to the lessons of New Guinea and Burma. Department of Defense Mobility Study, 1953. Psychologically, the Jeep also embodied the morale of an industrial democracy at war. To Axis soldiers, it represented an enemy who could not be exhausted. For Allied troops, it was a comfort. No matter how deep the mud, no matter how steep the ridge, there was a machine that could carry them through. That morale edge was priceless. U.S. Army Morale Division Report 1945. When peace came, the Jeep did not retire. Surplus models spread across the globe. Farmers bought them to plow fields. Explorers used them to cross deserts. In post-war Europe, they became symbols of liberation, rolling into towns that had never seen automobiles before. The military adopted new variants, from the Korean War to Vietnam, and eventually evolved into the Humvee and modern MRAPs. Yet every vehicle carried the DNA of that first boxy, canvas-topped scout car that had startled Japanese soldiers in the mountains of New Guinea. In the civilian imagination, the Jeep became more than a machine. It was a cultural icon. Hollywood war films of the 1950s and 60s featured Jeeps in nearly every scene. The civilian Jeep CJ line, born from wartime surplus, became a symbol of rugged independence. From muddy battlefields to suburban driveways, the vehicle's legacy endured. Jeep Company Historical Archive 1960. But its truest legacy was the lesson it carried, that in modern war, industrial ingenuity could tip the scales against even the fiercest defenders. Courage remained essential, but courage multiplied by mobility, and logistics became unstoppable. The Japanese had fought with valor, endurance, and tactical cunning. Yet against the quiet hum of mass-produced engines and the tire tracks carved into mountains, valor alone could not prevail. As one U.S. officer reflected in 1945, our soldiers walked, yes. They bled, yes. But behind them always was a Jeep. And that made the difference. U.S. Army Staff Journal, Pacific Theater, 1945. The story of the Jeep is not merely one of steel and rubber. It is the story of how an idea, speed and flexibility over brute force, reshaped the course of global conflict. It is the story of engineers who sketched designs in factories, of workers who bent steel under wartime urgency, of mechanics who hammered frames back to life in the mud, and of soldiers who climbed into battered seats and trusted the engine to carry them through hell. And in the silence that followed the war, when the last Jeeps rolled through ruined cities and occupied villages, they left behind more than tire tracks. They left a reminder etched into the doctrine of every army that followed. In the modern age, it is not just firepower that wins wars. It is the ability to move it, to sustain it, to carry it where no enemy believes it can go. Dramatized closing narration. In the jungles of New Guinea, the mountains of Burma, and the rice fields of the Philippines, Japanese soldiers could not believe what they saw. But the Americans knew the truth. The little Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was the wheel that turned the war.